The woman had been standing at the servants' gate of Ashgrove Park for the better part of an hour when Charlotte Rain noticed her through the estate office window, a dark shape unmoving in a downpour that had not eased since noon. Mrs. Pruitt, when Charlotte asked after her, waved a dismissive hand without looking up from the linen accounts. Some beggar woman claiming an acquaintance with the family, Miss Rain. I've told her twice the house does not receive strangers at the door, and twice she's refused to leave. She'll tire of the rain before I tire of refusing her. She has been standing in that rain for the better part of an hour, Mrs. Pruitt, tired or not, Charlotte said, already reaching for her cloak. I do not think Christian charity requires us to first confirm a person's acquaintance with the family before we offer them shelter from a storm. She found the woman collapsed nearly to her knees against the gatepost, drenched through to the bone, her bonnet ruined, and her hands, when Charlotte took them, cold as the stone she leaned against. She could not have been much past her 40th year by her voice, though the rain and exhaustion had aged her considerably beyond it, and she murmured something too faint to catch as Charlotte half carried her toward the kitchen door. Something that sounded, absurdly, like a fragment of a lullaby hummed under her breath, over and over, as though the tune itself were the only thing keeping her upright. The gravel of the drive had left the hem of her gown ruined beyond mending, and her boots, Charlotte noted with a seamstress's practical eye, had been resoled so many times there was scarcely any original leather left to them. The boots of a woman who had walked considerably further than any hired coach would have required, or who had not the coin to spare for one. Charlotte draped her own cloak over the woman's shoulders and rubbed some warmth back into hands gone nearly blue at the knuckles, murmuring the same steady reassurances she might have offered any frightened creature caught out in weather too cruel for it. I only wished to see him, the woman said, when Charlotte had gotten her into a chair by the kitchen fire and a cup of something warm into her shaking hands. I did not think anyone would still refuse me the door after so long. I did not think anyone would still remember to refuse me at all. Whom did you wish to see, ma'am? The woman's eyes, when she raised them, were a pale grey blue that struck Charlotte as strangely, unaccountably familiar, though she could not for the life of her think why. The Duke, she said. I have come a very long way to see the Duke of Ashgrove, and I find I have not the strength left to be turned away a third time. Ashgrove Park in autumn was a house of considerable outward grandeur, and Charlotte had come to understand in 3 years of managing its correspondence a rather more complicated inward temper, a young duke who had inherited both a title and a lifetime of his uncle's careful, well-meaning governance at the age of 7, and who had grown into his majority 5 years past, still unable, in Charlotte's private estimation, to entirely trust that any decision made on his behalf might not, eventually, prove to have served someone else's purpose more than his own. He managed his tenants with real conscience and his own household with a wary formality that Charlotte had spent 3 years quietly working to soften, one unremarkable act of competent loyalty at a time. Though she had never once permitted herself to examine too closely why she found the effort worth the trouble. Gabriel Fairfax, Duke of Ashgrove, returned from a morning spent inspecting a flooded tenant farm to find his own kitchen transformed into a scene of considerable domestic upheaval. Mrs. Pruitt wringing her hands by the larder, 2 under-housemaids whispering in the doorway, and his own secretary, Miss Charlotte Rain, kneeling by the fire beside a bedraggled stranger with the calm, unhurried competence he had come, over 3 years of her steady management of his correspondence and his temper both, to rely upon more than he had ever admitted aloud. Miss Rain, I am given to understand there is some difficulty regarding an uninvited caller. There is a woman half frozen through who was left standing at the gate for the better part of an hour, Your Grace, on Mrs. Pruitt's understanding that the house does not receive strangers. Charlotte rose to face him, and something in the steadiness of her, she had never once, in 3 years, flinched from delivering him an unwelcome truth, struck him now with a force he did not entirely understand, an involuntary awareness of the particular stillness in her hands even now, faced with a household in disarray, as though nothing in the world could truly unsettle her. "I did not think your Grace would wish a woman turned away from his own door to die of exposure over a rule Mrs. Pruitt could not even properly explain the origin of." "It is not my rule to explain, Miss Rain," Mrs. Pruitt said, wringing her apron. "It has stood since before I came into this household 30 years past, Mr. Fairfax's own instruction, sent down from his lordship the year of the old Duke's death, that no woman claiming acquaintance with the late Duchess was ever to be admitted past the gate, whatever excuse she offered." Gabriel went very still. "My uncle gave that order?" "Aye, your Grace, in the first weeks after your father passed, and before you'd reached your majority. I've enforced it faithfully these 20 years, same as every housekeeper before me, and never once had cause to question it, seeing as her late ladyship, Mrs. Pruitt's voice dropped, uncomfortable, seeing as the old Duchess passed on herself not long after. God rest her. The stranger by the fire made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob, and lifted her face to Gabriel's for the first time since he had entered the room. "I did not pass on, Mrs. Pruitt," she said, quiet and unsteady. "I have been considerably more alive than your master's uncle found convenient these 20 years, though I confess this morning's rain came nearer to finishing the job than anything else has managed since." The room went entirely silent, and Gabriel Fairfax looked at a woman he had been told, since the age of 7, had died of a fever within a year of his father's passing, and found, in the pale grey blue of her eyes, and the fragment of a half-hummed tune still lingering on her breath, something he had not consciously remembered in 20 years, and could not now, standing in his own kitchen with the fire crackling between them, pretend he did not recognize at all. "You cannot be," he said, and his voice, usually so carefully governed, came out entirely undone. "My mother is dead. I attended no funeral because there was no body to bury in time, I was told, but I have believed it the whole of my life. I am considerably more than a belief, Gabriel," she said, and the use of his given name, spoken by a stranger who had no right to it by any account he had ever been given, landed on him like a physical blow. "I am your mother, and I have spent 20 years believing you were better served by a dead mother than a living one your uncle had declared unfit, until I could no longer, in good conscience, let that lie stand between us while there was breath left in me to correct it." Mrs. Pruitt, for her part, had gone entirely white. One hand braced against the larder shelf as though the floor itself had shifted beneath her. "I have served this family faithfully 30 years, your Grace, and I would not for the world have left her ladyship standing in the rain had I known. Had anyone thought to tell me—" Her voice broke entirely, and Charlotte, who had spent 3 years finding the housekeeper stern to the point of unkindness, felt an unexpected wash of sympathy for a woman who had simply done, for 2 decades, precisely what she had been instructed to do by a family she had no reason to distrust. "No one blames you, Mrs. Pruitt," Cecilia said, with a gentleness that startled everyone in the room, herself perhaps most of all. "You obeyed the only instruction you were ever given. I do not hold a housekeeper's loyalty against her. I hold it against the man who gave the order, and never once, in 20 years, saw fit to countermand it." Charlotte watched the Duke's composure, the same composure she had spent 3 years coming to know as armor rather than temperament, fracture entirely in the space of a single sentence, and understood, with a clarity that would trouble her sleep considerably in the nights that followed, that whatever this household had built itself around for 20 years was about to come apart at the seams. Gabriel did not sleep that night, nor did Charlotte, who sat up late in the estate office reviewing, at his quiet and unusual request, every ledger and correspondence file relating to his minority that the house still possessed. "I do not ask you to believe her outright, Miss Rain," he had said, standing in the doorway with a look she had never once seen on him in 3 years of managing his tempers and his tenants both. "I ask you to help me determine whether it is even possible to disbelieve her, given what my uncle stood to gain by her disappearance." What they found, by the second candle's guttering end, was a trustee's accounting that balanced too neatly in places it had no obvious reason to balance at all. A jointure of £1,200 a year, the Dowager Duchess's rightful widow's portion under the marriage settlement, quietly redirected for 2 decades into an account administered solely by Lord Simon Fairfax, Gabriel's uncle and former guardian, under the standing certification that the Duchess herself had forfeited her portion through proven scandal and had since died, a certification no court or solicitor appeared to have independently verified in all that time. £1,200 a year for 20 years, Charlotte said quietly, the sum settling between them with the particular weight of a number too large to be accidental. "Your uncle did not merely permit a rumour of your mother's death to stand uncorrected, Your Grace. He built an income from it. Cecilia herself, once she had rested and eaten and been persuaded, gently, to tell what she could bear to tell, described a winter night 20 years past when Simon Fairfax had come to her rooms within a fortnight of her husband's funeral, while she was still deep in mourning and Gabriel scarcely old enough to understand what a funeral meant, and informed her that the trustees had found irregularities in her personal accounts sufficient to question her fitness to remain in the boy's household. "I had signed nothing irregular in my life," she told them, her voice steadier now than it had been at the gate, though her hands still trembled faintly around her teacup. "But I was a widow of 29, with no living family of consequence to speak for me, and your uncle had already secured the signatures of 2 trustees before I ever learned there was an accusation to answer. He offered me £500 and passage to my cousin's household in Yorkshire, on the condition I never again attempt to contact my son, and warned me that any resistance would see the accusation made public, and Gabriel's own inheritance dragged through scandal alongside my name. I took the money, because I did not believe, in that moment, that I had any other choice left to protect him. Then I begin to understand," Gabriel said, "lo, precisely why my uncle worked so diligently to see her declared dead rather than merely disgraced." He looked at Charlotte across the candlelit ledgers, and something in the steadiness of her attention, she had not once, through an entire night of upheaval, treated him as anything other than a man capable of bearing whatever truth the accounts revealed, settled something in him that the last hours had otherwise entirely undone. "I do not know how to thank you for sitting up half the night over another man's crimes, Miss Rain." "You do not need to thank me, Your Grace. I have sat up over considerably duller matters on your behalf these 3 years. I find I would rather sit up over one that actually signifies." She did not tell him, that night, what she had told no one at Ashgrove Park in 3 years of service, that her own father, the estate's land agent before her, had died owing a debt to a neighbouring landlord who had shown him no mercy in the settling of it, and that she had come to this household at 19 with nothing but a good hand for figures, and a private, unshakable conviction that competence, carefully applied, was the one inheritance no one could ever take from a person twice. She recognized something of that same conviction in the woman shivering by the kitchen fire, and it was, she suspected, no small part of why she had gone out into the rain for her at all. The particular, hard-earned instinct of a woman who had once needed someone to look past her circumstances and had not always found them willing to. The first crack came the following afternoon, when Lord Simon Fairfax arrived at Ashgrove Park with the particular haste of a man who has heard, by whatever channel such news travels, that a ghost he had buried 20 years before was sitting in his nephew's drawing room drinking tea. He was a broad, silver-haired man whose affability had always struck Charlotte as a fraction too rehearsed, and he wasted no time at all establishing the shape of his defense. "Gabriel, my boy, I understand a woman has arrived claiming to be your mother." His voice carried the easy authority of a man who had managed the boy's affairs and believed he still managed the man's regard for 2 decades. "I would urge considerable caution before you extend this person any credence at all. There are those who would seek to prey upon a young duke's grief for their own gain, and a woman claiming a dead duchess's identity 20 years removed from any proof is precisely such a case. She hummed me a lullaby I have not heard since I was 7 years old, uncle, and could not, until this morning, have told you I remembered it all," Gabriel said, his voice dangerously even. "I find that a considerably more persuasive proof than the accounting irregularities Miss Rain and I discovered last night regarding my mother's jointure, redirected into your own management these 20 years past, on the strength of a death no solicitor ever independently confirmed." Something in Simon's affable composure went very still. "You have been misled, Gabriel, by a woman's memory of a tune any nursemaid in England might have sung, and by ledgers whose complexity you have never troubled yourself to fully understand. I would not have you ruin this family's standing over sentiment poorly examined. I have examined the accounts myself, Lord Simon, line by line, alongside His Grace," Charlotte said, stepping forward before she had entirely decided to. "I do not think it sentiment to observe that a jointure of £1,200 a year, certified forfeit on the strength of an accusation no court ever heard, and a death no physician ever recorded, is rather more easily explained by your own management of it than by any scandal on the Duchess's part." Simon's gaze swung to her with the particular contempt of a man unaccustomed to being contradicted by hired help. "This is a family matter, Miss Rain, and not, I think, one that requires the opinion of a secretary. It is a family matter that Miss Rain has managed more honestly in 3 years than you managed in 20, uncle," Gabriel said, before Charlotte could answer for herself, "and I would ask you to address her with the respect her diligence has earned, or not address her at all. I would not have this family's standing built any longer on a lie you have profited from for 20 years, uncle," Gabriel said, and Charlotte, watching from the doorway, saw the Duke she had spent 3 years serving finally, visibly, choose to stop being managed by the one relation who had always assumed he always would be. Simon left without another word, though not before his gaze passed once more over the drawing room, over Cecilia, seated by the window with a composure she had not fully recovered in 3 days, over the ledgers still spread across the side table, over Charlotte standing unmoved beside his nephew, with an expression Charlotte recognized, uneasily, as the particular calculation of a man reassessing how much he stood to lose, and precisely how far he might go to prevent losing it. She said nothing of her unease to Gabriel that evening, telling herself there was no profit in alarming him further before she had anything more solid than instinct to offer, though she found herself, in the days that followed, watching the drive rather more often than her correspondence strictly required. The almost came 3 evenings later, in the estate office where Charlotte had taken to working late over the accumulating evidence of Simon's fraud, when Gabriel found her still bent over a ledger long after the household had retired, and sat down across from her without announcing himself. Exhaustion and grief, and something considerably warmer than either evident in his face. "I do not know how to hold all of this at once," he admitted. "Lo, a mother returned from the dead. An uncle who has stolen from her for 20 years and raised me, all the while, to believe him the very picture of family loyalty. I find I have needed, these 3 days, someone steady to hold on to, and I have found myself, rather more often than propriety allows, wanting that someone to be you." He reached across the ledger and covered her hand with his, and Charlotte felt her breath catch entirely at the warmth of it, at the particular, unguarded honesty in his face, that 3 years of careful professional distance had never once permitted her to see directed at herself. She thought of every evening these 3 years she had told herself, firmly, that a secretary did not permit herself to notice the particular way her employer's composure eased whenever he crossed the threshold of this office, that such noticing led nowhere a sensible woman ought to wish to go. She had been, she realized now, considerably less successful at that discipline than she had allowed herself to believe. "Your Grace, Gabriel," he said, "I think, after the week we have both had, we might dispense with the title between us, at least in this room." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a care that undid, in a single motion, every careful distance 3 years of employer and secretary had built between them, and she felt the whole unbearable nearness of him crowding out every sensible thought she had ever rehearsed for exactly this eventuality. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the candlelight catching gold in the ledgers between them, and Charlotte understood, with a clarity that frightened her rather more than any of Simon's veiled threats had, that whatever this was between them had stopped being merely professional loyalty a good while before either of them had troubled to name it aloud. Then, a floorboard creaked in the corridor, one of the housemaids passing late to bank the fires, and Gabriel withdrew his hand as though scalded by his own wanting. Leaving Charlotte sitting alone among the ledgers, with her heart going like a struck bell, and the ghost of an almost kiss, she suspected she would carry a good while, longer than propriety would ever comfortably allow. Cecilia's 20 years, once she found the strength to speak of them at length, had been spent first in genuine want. 2 winters in Yorkshire on her cousin's grudging charity before the £500 ran out entirely. And then, in a hard-won, careful independence, working as a paid companion to an elderly widow in Shropshire, under the name Mrs. Ellison, teaching herself to be invisible in exactly the way a duchess was never meant to learn. "I told myself, every year, that the following spring I would find the courage to write to you," she confessed to Gabriel one quiet evening, "and every year I convinced myself instead that a letter from a woman your uncle had declared unfit would only endanger you further, until the widow I served passed away last winter and left me, for the first time in 20 years, entirely without a household to hide inside. I had nothing left to lose by coming, and everything left to gain, however small the chance. The choice came at the harvest supper a fortnight later, a gathering of tenants and neighbouring gentry Gabriel had insisted upon hosting despite Mrs. Pruitt's nervous protests that the household was hardly settled enough for entertaining. He stood before the assembled company with his mother, restored to health and dressed, for the first time in 20 years, in a manner befitting her true rank, seated at his right hand, and said, plainly, for every tenant and neighbour to hear, 20 years ago, my uncle told this county my mother was dead. Rather than let it be known, he had driven her from her own home to protect an embezzlement he has profited from ever since. I will not have that lie stand a single day longer. My mother is the Dowager Duchess of Ashgrove, and she will be treated as such by every soul under this roof, and every tenant on this land, beginning tonight. The hall went silent, the particular silence that precedes either scandal or reckoning, broken at last by an elderly tenant farmer near the back rising unsteadily to his feet and declaring, in a voice that carried the whole length of the room, that he had known her ladyship as a young bride 22 years past, and had grieved her passing sincerely, and would be glad, if his grace permitted it, to be the first to welcome her properly home. A ragged, uncertain cheer followed, gathering strength as more of the older tenants added their own voices to it, and Cecilia Fairfax, sitting very straight beside the son she had not seen grown to manhood, allowed herself, for the first time in 20 years, to weep openly in front of witnesses who had once been told she did not exist to weep in front of at all. The cost came within the week, when Simon Fairfax, cornered and desperate, moved to destroy what evidence remained, rather than face the accounting Gabriel now openly demanded. It was one of the under-footmen, bribed with a sum considerably beyond his usual year's wages, and frightened badly enough afterward to confess the whole of it to Mrs. Pruitt, who let Simon's man into the old records room after midnight, a fire, deliberately set among a full generation of trustee correspondence, blazing high enough by the time it was discovered that the household staff fought it for the better part of an hour, with buckets from the courtyard well before it was finally beaten out, taking with it, Gabriel feared as he stood coughing in the smoke-blackened doorway at dawn, the very documents that would have proven beyond doubt the 20 years of redirected jointure. Cecilia, believing her return had cost her son nothing but danger and her presence nothing but scandal, spent the whole of that night in silent grief in her borrowed chamber, listening to the household's frightened commotion below and remembering, with a clarity 20 years had done nothing to dull, the particular helplessness of watching harm come to people she loved because of choices that had once seemed, at the time, entirely outside her control. By dawn, she had made ready to leave again, rather than see the family further ruined on her account, her trunk packed with the same meager collection of belongings she had carried into her 20 years of quiet exile, and it was Charlotte who found her at the gate, exactly where she had once been turned away in the rain. "You are doing to him now what your husband's brother did to you 20 years ago," Charlotte said, blocking her path with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "You are deciding, on his behalf, that losing you again is a mercy, rather than the very wound he has spent 3 days healing from having your presence finally stitched shut." She caught the older woman's hands, cold again despite the mild morning. "Your Grace, stop protecting him from a truth he has already chosen to fight for, and let him finish the fight instead." Gabriel arrived at the gate himself minutes later, breathless from having discovered her absent chamber, and it was there, in the grey morning light, where his mother had once stood drenched and unrecognized, that Charlotte pressed into his hand the one piece of evidence Simon's fire had not reached. A duplicate ledger she had, out of long professional habit, copied into her own private correspondence book the very first night, precisely because she had learned, in 3 years of managing a household's accounts, never to trust that a single copy of anything important was safe. "I did not think a man capable of burning down a records room would hesitate to burn the only copy of his own guilt," she said. "I made certain there was a second." The collapse of distance came in the estate office an hour later, evidence secured, and Cecilia persuaded, finally, to unpack her trunk, when Gabriel took Charlotte's face in both hands and said, roughly, "I have spent 3 years telling myself that wanting my own secretary was an indulgence I had no business permitting myself, and I find, after the week we have both survived, that I no longer have the smallest interest in permitting myself anything less." He kissed her then, unhurried and devastating despite the urgency behind it. The kiss of a man finally choosing to want something openly after 20 years raised by an uncle who had taught him, without ever saying so plainly, that trust was a currency too dangerous to spend. When he drew back, he pressed his forehead to hers and said, "Marry me, Charlotte, and let my uncle choke on the scandal of a duke who married for love rather than sense." Lord Simon Fairfax was confronted before the county magistrate the following month, in a hearing room considerably fuller than such proceedings usually warranted, word having travelled through the county with the particular speed reserved for scandals involving dukes. Charlotte's duplicate ledger was entered into evidence alongside the frightened underfootman's sworn account of the fire, and Gabriel himself spoke plainly of an uncle who had raised him to believe loyalty flowed only downward, from nephew to guardian, while quietly building a fortune on the strength of a lie about his own sister-in-law's death. Simon attempted, briefly, to claim the duplicate ledger itself was a forgery, manufactured by a secretary with designs upon the family's fortune. A charge the magistrate dismissed within minutes once 3 separate tenants testified, unprompted, to jointure payments they had personally witnessed diverted through Simon's own steward over the years. He offered no further defense beyond a furious, cornered silence once the fire he had set was proven, by the surviving copy, to have destroyed nothing but his own last chance at concealment. He was stripped of his trusteeship, his considerable ill-gotten fortune seized to restore his sister-in-law's 20 years of unpaid jointure in full, and removed to a distant cottage in Wales where, it was generally agreed, the county's good opinion would trouble him considerably less than his own conscience ought to. Mr. Corbett, the estate's own solicitor, who had drawn up trustee papers for Simon without ever once questioning their accuracy, remarked afterward to Gabriel that he had rarely in 30 years of practice seen a fraud so thoroughly unmade by a single duplicate ledger and a housekeeper's honest testimony, and Charlotte, hearing the remark second-hand, allowed herself a rare, private satisfaction in it. Mrs. Pruitt, who had spent 30 years enforcing an order she never had cause to question, took to fussing over the Dowager Duchess with a devotion that bordered on the maternal, as though 30 years of unwitting obedience to a cruel instruction might somehow be answered, in full, by an excess of careful attention now. Cecilia, for her part, never once held it against her, and the two women became, in their own quiet way, considerably closer than mistress and housekeeper generally allowed themselves to be. Cecilia Fairfax, Dowager Duchess of Ashgrove, lived to see her son married that spring in the same hall where he had once publicly reclaimed her name, humming at the wedding breakfast. The same half-remembered lullaby that had first stirred Gabriel's recognition in the rain, now sung plainly and completely for the first time in 20 years. Charlotte wore, at her own insistence, a gown of considerably plainer cut than the occasion strictly demanded, remarking to Gabriel that a woman who had spent 3 years managing his correspondence in sensible wool saw no reason to abandon good sense entirely on the single day she most needed her wits about her. And Gabriel had laughed, properly and without restraint, for what Mrs. Pruitt swore was the first time she had heard in the whole of his adult life. Cecilia stood as witness beside her son, her own jointure fully restored and settled, at her insistence, largely upon improvements to the tenant cottages and a small annuity for Mrs. Pruitt's eventual retirement, remarking that 20 years of having nothing had taught her rather more about the proper use of money than 20 years of having everything ever had. A year later, Cecilia sat in the nursery she had once been driven from, teaching the tune properly to her first grandchild. The same window seat where she had once, decades before, hummed it to a boy of 7 who would not remember the words again until a rain-soaked afternoon brought her back to him. Gabriel and Charlotte watched from the doorway with the particular quiet joy of 2 people who had built, out of a household's oldest lie, something considerably more honest to replace it. A home where no order stood unquestioned, no debt went unexamined, and no woman, whatever the household's standing instructions, would ever again be left standing in the rain. Mrs. Pruitt, passing the doorway with an armful of fresh linens, paused just long enough to observe that the nursery had not sounded so full of ordinary happiness in the whole of her 30 years in service, and went on her way well satisfied that she had lived, after all, to see the household's oldest wrong finally, thoroughly set right.